We begin our last module looking at the fin de siècle, the turn of the century. The fin de siècle means end of the century or turn of the century in French. This term really implies not only the turning of one century to another, but particularly in terms of one distinct era ending and another beginning. This era was noted for its intense boredom, cynicism, pessimism, and decadence. Here we see a painting by the turn of the century visual artist Gustav Klimt. In this painting, The Kiss, we see all these wonderful yellows and this rich, sumptuous color. In fact, there is actually gold in this painting. Klimt's style is reminiscent of many of the musical aspects that are going on at this time in artistic history. We have some representational elements here. We can tell that there are two people in an embrace. They seem to be in a field and they seem to be garbed in rich clothing. However, there are some distinct aspects that are not directly representational. We start to see the outlines of their form, the vague idea of flowers, and an even vaguer idea of the background. What time of day is it? Is it dusk? Is it sunrise? Is it not a time of day at all? We have these questions open to interpretation. There is direct representation, but there is also ambiguity. And we will see composers play upon this ambiguity in their music. Important movements during the fin de siècle include psychophysiology, now just called psychology, of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. There is also the egoism and perversity of the decadent and aesthete movements, as well as impressionism, which was originally a derogatory term and focused on the depiction of light, movement, and perception. Mahler and Strauss are really wrapped up in this movement or this time period in their own way in Vienna. We looked at them as part of the late Romantic era and the post-Romantic era coming out of the German-speaking lands. We're going to move on then into Impressionism. We'll talk about Impressionism and then follow it with the avant-garde. Impressionism, as I mentioned, was a derogatory term coined by the art critic Louis Leroy to satirize the works of a new school of painters who came to prominence in late 19th century Paris. This includes the works of Claude Monet and Pierre-Auguste Renoir. Here we see one such impression by Claude Monet. You can see that the emphasis here is not on the direct representation of form. Although we have the sense that we are looking at a harbor and at a sunset, the important aspect here seems to be light and the reflection and refraction of light. Though Debussy and Ravel did not like the term in its application to music, there are certainly some similarities. Particularly, we can see the emphasis on color, refracting material through a variety of modes, including an interest in whole tone and octatonic scales, as well as an interest in the exotic. For instance, if you take a look at Debussy's prelude Voile, you can hear that it begins in a whole tone scale, then moves to a pentatonic scale, and then back to whole tone. It's almost like these scales are filters through which the musical ideas pass, and we see colors refracted in different ways. Again, that's Voile, V-O-I-L-E-S, by Debussy, if you want to check that out. Let's talk about Debussy for a little bit. He's born to a middle-class family, and he began studies at the age of 10 at the Paris Conservatoire. He also studied in Russia before winning the Prix de Rome, the Rome Prize, which allowed him to study in Italy for 2 years. Afterwards, he returned to Paris to pursue composition as well as music criticism. He befriended the symbolist poets. Symbolism was described by Jean Morier in 1886. In this art, scenes from nature, human activities, and all other real-world phenomena will not be described for their own sake. Here they are perceptible surfaces, created to represent the esoteric affinities with the primordial ideals. So these surface structures are getting at a mystical nature that lies beneath. We certainly see this in Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun, based on the poem by Stéphane Mallarmé. If you read even just a little of this, you get the sense of a humid, otherworldly experience. These nymphs, I would perpetuate them, so bright their crimson flesh that hovers here, light in the air drowsy with dense slumbers. Did I love a dream? My doubt, mass of ancient night, ends extreme in many a subtle branch, that remaining the true woods themselves proves, alas, that I too offered myself alone as triumph, the false ideal of roses. This is not representational poetry. This is poetry of mood and color and image. We are interested in the interaction of ideas rather than the distinct representation of form. Likewise, in Debussy's musical fantasia on this poem, we have lots of ambiguity. The opening flute melody outlines a tritone. We don't have a clear sense of the tonality until we move forwards and we start hearing the first harmonies. But even then, they are unstable harmonies, and we don't really get a sense of where we are for quite a while. It's always slightly kaleidoscopic, the colors always turning and becoming something else. Maurice Ravel is also frequently lumped into this impressionistic category, though Ravel's music is subtly different than Debussy's. Ravel's musical language tends to prize craft, traditional forms, and diatonic melodies couched within complex harmonic systems, though ultimately with tonal tendencies. So we can view Debussy as being more interested in color and effect, and Ravel slightly more interested in perhaps a classical sense of craft. Though Basque by birth, Ravel reveled in French culture, incorporating French popular traditions, as well as classical instruments, or rather, classical elements. For instance, the forms of the string quartet in F major conform very closely to the sonata forms and classical style forms that we've seen before. He's also interested in historical elements. For instance, Le Tombeau de Couperin, the tomb of Couperin. Remember, Couperin is the sort of French harpsichord master of the late Baroque. Here, Ravel is referencing back to this old master and showing a compositional tradition there. Non-French elements include La Valse, which incorporates Viennese waltz rhythms, Tzigane for violin and piano, which evokes gypsy-style music, and Piano Concerto for the left hand, which includes jazz elements. Left-hand piano concertos and piano works were common during the early part of the 20th century because so many young artists were wounded during the course of World War I. Let's take a look at his string quartet in F. We'll just listen to a little bit of the first movement, but you can hear a complex set of harmonic structures that are undergirding an ultimately diatonic melody. You'll also see that every line is acting independently, so there is a true sense of counterpoint here. I wish we could just keep listening to that. It's one of my favorite pieces, but we must keep on going. However, I do want to make mention that in the midst of this counterpoint, we do have interest in color. For instance, this melody, which begins the secondary theme area that we just heard, is doubled 2 octaves apart between the viola and the violin, creating a sort of eerie, coloristic sound that really shows how interested composers of this era are not just in counterpoint in development, but in color and orchestration as well. And to the extent that color and orchestration will become actual developmental characteristics of future music within the 20th century. Very briefly, a few other composers of the fin de siècle. In Great Britain, we have Ralph Vaughan Williams, who studied with Ravel. He incorporated folk elements into many of his works, as well as distinctively English elements. One work to listen to is Fantasia on a Theme of Thomas Tallis. Not only is it beautiful, but again, it references a past tradition. It references the Renaissance composer, the Renaissance English composer, Thomas Tallis. We also have Gustav Holst. He also used folk elements, but was also influenced by outside cultures as well as astrology. His orchestral suite, The Planets, is his best known work, though his study of Bach resulted in an outpouring of choral music as well. There's also the Czech composer Leos Janáček, who created a nationalist style based on his study of folk music from Moravia. His musical style resembles Mussorgsky and Debussy, rather than Brahms or Liszt, the other composers who are referencing this this area of Europe in their writing. There are Russian composer-pianists like Alexander Scriabin and Sergei Rachmaninoff, who studied together at the Moscow Conservatory. They incorporate Western elements into a Russian style, and a particularly virtuosic one. Scriabin's music is also very mystically infused. He, like Debussy, was interested in an idea that music could create an essential effect upon the world. In fact, Scriabin believed this so deeply that in one work he said that if a certain chord were played perfectly, it would cause the end of the world. Hasn't happened yet, but I challenge you to try. And there's also Jean Sibelius. Sibelius sought to create a national style in Finland, which was part of the Russian Empire from 1809 until 1917, and was also dominated by Sweden. So they are working for their independence and also their musical independence. So Sibelius became wrapped up in this nationalistic fervor for independence. He wrote music inspired by the Finnish national epic, the Kalevala. His musical style is noted for modal melodies, repetition of brief motives, as well as ostinatos and pedal tones. A keen ear to unique timbres and textures, and also the utilization of a rotational form that frequently cycles throughout thematic elements. Take a listen to some of his tone poems, as well as the symphonies number 2, 4, and 5, for to see the vast terrain that he covers, the vastly different styles that he references. We turn now to the avant-garde. The avant-garde, or advance-garde, or fore-garde, refers to artists that attempt to overthrow certain aesthetic procedures. This is the tendency that we'll start to see throughout much of the 20th century. Overthrowing certain artistic procedures, finding new styles and new schools of thought. It is not a movement that shares a style, but rather an attitude. Resist or overturn the status quo. Here we see a piece of visual art from this time, Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase, number 2. You can actually see this in person if you just make the short trip up to the Philadelphia Museum of Art. You'll notice that, again, this is not really representational. Certainly, we do have a sense of motion, all these active lines creating the sense of a figure moving down steps. However, we don't see this figure. A nude study in other times would allow us to see how the artist captures the musculature and the human form. Here, we don't get that. We have a sense of motion. We have the idea of this person descending, the idea of a staircase. And even then, it's not quite solid. So what we are seeing here is an artist overthrowing the expectations of what is placed upon them when they are doing a study piece. In music, Erik Satie was one such member of the avant-garde. Erik Satie challenged the individual expression of the Romantic era in his Gymnopids, which is plainly expressed and unemotional. His other works frequently challenge expected classical expectations of form. For instance, 3 pieces in the form of a pair is actually 7 pieces. This challenging of expectations and expression continues in pieces like Vexations, which is a brief piece which is supposed to be performed over and over and over and over again, making music less enjoyable. We'll see other composers that are taking musical expectations and turning them on their head as we move throughout the 20th century.